They called it friendship. They called it devotion. They called it anything except what it was. What happens when an entire kind of love is erased, not by accident, but on purpose? Across history, women wrote letters that sound like obsession. They lived together for decades. They exchanged rings. They called each other soulmates. And historians? They called them very close friends. So were these just emotional bonds? Or are we looking at something history refused to name? Because the strangest part isn't that these relationships existed. It's how hard people worked to make sure you'd never recognize them. If you open most history books, love between women barely exists. You'll find kings with mistresses, emperors with scandals, and men whose relationships shaped entire empires. But women loving women? Almost invisible. Reduced to a footnote. Or rewritten as something safer. This creates a very convenient illusion that these relationships were rare, modern, or somehow invented recently. They weren't. They were everywhere. The real question is not whether they existed. It's why they were erased. To understand that, you need to look at how women were positioned in most of history. For centuries, women were not treated as fully independent individuals. Their lives were structured through fathers, husbands, inheritance, and family alliances. Marriage wasn't just expected, it was a system that held society together. And that system had a blind spot. It centered male desire so heavily that female desire, especially outside of men, was often ignored, misunderstood, or deliberately dismissed. That created one of the most effective hiding places in history. Because if something isn't acknowledged, it becomes easy to pretend it doesn't exist. When men formed relationships with other men, societies reacted, sometimes with punishment, sometimes with fascination, but almost always with documentation. But when women formed intense bonds, they were renamed companions, devoted friends, household partners, spiritual sisters. Labels that sound harmless, but quietly erase meaning. Sometimes this ambiguity protected women. Sometimes it trapped them. Because if history refuses to name something, it also refuses to take it seriously. And this pattern goes back further than most people realize. In ancient Greece, one of the clearest voices still survives, Sappho. Her poetry, written around the 6th century BCE, speaks directly of desire, longing, and emotional intensity toward women. Not subtly. Not vaguely. And yet, for centuries, scholars tried to reinterpret her. They called her symbolic. They called her misunderstood. They reframed her words until they fit something more acceptable. But the original language is still there. Even the word lesbian traces back to the island of Lesbos. Which tells you something important. This history was never missing. It was edited. As time moved forward, especially into the Roman world, things became more complicated. Roman society viewed relationships through power, status, and roles. Female same-sex relationships weren't discussed as openly, but when they were, they often triggered discomfort. Because they challenged something fundamental. The idea that women needed men to define their lives. That idea has always been protected. Which is why, as religious influence grew, especially under expanding Christian institutions, control over behavior became stricter. But even then, something interesting happens. You don't see consistent records of women loving women. Not because it stopped. But because it became easier to ignore, unless it needed to be punished. And in between those moments of silence, real lives kept unfolding. Inside homes, courts, and religious spaces, women formed relationships that were emotionally intense, sometimes lifelong, and often deeply private. Take convents, for example. They were meant to be spaces of discipline and devotion. But they were also one of the few environments where women lived almost entirely among other women, away from forced marriage. Some letters from these spaces show deep emotional attachment. Not all of them were romantic. But some raise questions that historians still debate. And that uncertainty isn't accidental. It exists because the people recording these lives had every reason to keep things undefined. Because once you define something, you acknowledge it. And once you acknowledge it, you can't easily erase it. By the time you reach the 18th and 19th centuries, another pattern becomes visible, something historians now call romantic friendship. Women openly expressed intense affection for each other. They wrote emotional letters. They lived together. They shared beds while traveling. They exchanged gifts, rings, and promises of lifelong devotion. And society allowed it. As long as it stayed within a certain boundary. As long as it looked pure. As long as it didn't openly challenge marriage. As long as no one forced a label onto it. Because labels make people uncomfortable. And discomfort forces confrontation. So instead, people chose a safer explanation. They're just close. But here's where it gets interesting. If you take the same behaviors, the letters, the shared lives, the emotional language, and apply them to a man and a woman, most people wouldn't hesitate to call it a relationship. But when it involves two women, suddenly, the standard of proof becomes impossible. And that double standard buried entire histories. Because when something doesn't fit the system doesn't always destroy it. Sometimes, it simply rewrites it. And that rewriting is about to get a lot harder to ignore. Now comes the part history struggles to explain away. Because once you move past broad patterns, you start seeing real people. Real names. Real lives. Real relationships that don't fit neatly into just friends. And the more specific the stories get, the harder they are to ignore. Let's start in the late 18th century, a time when reputation meant everything. Two women, born into the Irish aristocracy, built a life together that openly challenged expectations, Eleanor Butler and Sarah Ponsonby. Their story doesn't begin quietly. It begins with an escape. Both were under pressure to marry. Both were expected to follow the script laid out for women of their status. And both chose not to. Instead, they attempted to run away together. Not once. Multiple times. Families intervened. Society reacted. But eventually, they succeeded. They settled in a small Welsh town called Llangollen, where they built a shared home and lived together for over 50 years. 50. Not months. Not a phase. A lifetime. They dressed similarly. They shared finances. They structured their entire lives around each other. Visitors came from across Europe just to meet them, including writers, aristocrats, and political figures. And how were they described? A curious friendship. A romantic attachment. A peculiar companionship. Again, the same pattern. Everything is visible, except the label. Now pause for a second. If a man and a woman ran away together, lived in the same house for decades, and refused all other romantic ties, what would people call it? Exactly. But here, history hesitates. And that hesitation is the story. Now move slightly forward, into the 19th century, where we get something even more difficult to ignore. Detailed personal diaries. Meet and Lister. At first glance, she doesn't look like someone history would erase. She was wealthy, educated, a landowner, independent in ways most women of her time weren't. But what makes her different is this. She documented her life in extreme detail. Thousands of pages of diaries. And within them, she wrote about her relationships with women. Explicitly. Emotionally. Repeatedly. So explicitly, in fact, that she encoded parts of her writing in a private cipher. Not because she was unsure, but because she knew exactly how dangerous it would be if others understood. Her entries describe attraction, relationships, jealousy, commitment, even ceremonies that closely resemble marriage. This is no longer vague. This is personal. This is undeniable. And yet, for over a century, much of her writing was ignored, hidden, or dismissed as eccentric. Only much later did historians fully decode and recognize what she had written. Which raises an uncomfortable question. How many other stories were never decoded? Because Anne Lister only becomes visible to us because she left behind proof that was too detailed to erase completely. Most people didn't have that luxury. Now let's shift again, not to aristocrats or landowners, but to something far more common and far more quietly erased. Shared domestic lives. Across the 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a phenomenon sometimes referred to as Boston marriages. Two women living together, often financially independent, sharing a household without men. Some were practical arrangements. Some were emotional partnerships. Some were clearly something deeper. But society tolerated them, again, under one condition. Don't name it. Because once something is named, it becomes real. And once it becomes real, it becomes a threat. And this is where the tone shifts. Because as history moves closer to the modern era, the tolerance starts disappearing. Earlier, ambiguity acted as a shield. Now, it starts attracting attention. Medical institutions begin classifying behavior. Legal systems begin defining boundaries. Society begins deciding what is normal and what is not. And women who had previously lived in quiet ambiguity start being watched, judged, pathologized. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the rise of psychology and medical science didn't just study human behavior. It categorized it. Sometimes inaccurately. Sometimes aggressively. Same-sex relationships, including between women, began to be labeled as disorders, deviations, or conditions to be explained. Which sounds like recognition. But it wasn't. It was control. Because once something is labeled as a problem, it can be corrected. Or punished. Or erased more systematically than ever before. And suddenly, the same relationships that were once ignored became targets. And yet, even under that pressure, the pattern doesn't disappear. It adjusts. Letters still get written. Lives still intertwine. Women still chose each other. But there's more caution now. More silence. More awareness of what can and cannot be said out loud. And still, traces remain. They always do. A letter that feels too intense to ignore. A will that leaves everything to one woman. A shared life that stretches decades. Not one example. Not two. Many. Enough to form a pattern. And patterns raise questions. Not loud ones. But persistent ones. Because once you've seen enough of these lives, you stop asking if something existed. You start asking something else. Why does it keep being described the same way? Why does the language stay careful, even when the lives don't? Why do certain details get emphasized, while others quietly disappear? And here's where it gets even more interesting. Some of these women weren't just surviving quietly. They were shaping culture. Writers, artists, intellectuals, people whose work influenced entire generations, formed relationships with other women that were deeply embedded in their lives. But when their stories were recorded later, those relationships were softened, edited, sometimes erased entirely, because acknowledging them would force a rewrite of everything around them. And history doesn't like rewriting itself. It prefers adjusting the narrative just enough to stay comfortable. Now go back to what you've seen so far. Women who ran away together. Women who lived together for decades. Women who wrote about loving other women in their own words. Women who built entire lives side by side. And yet, generation after generation, the same explanation repeats. They were just friends. None of this is hidden. It's just framed. Carefully. Consistently. In a way that avoids one specific conclusion. And that consistency is hard to ignore. Because when different stories across different places keep getting explained the same way, it stops looking like coincidence. And starts looking like a pattern of control. And this is where everything changes. Because once you recognize the pattern, you can't unsee it. Every close friendship starts looking different. Every shared life starts raising questions. Every erased detail starts feeling intentional. And the story changes. It's no longer about proving anything. It's about noticing what was never clearly said. And more importantly, noticing who benefited from it staying hidden. And once you notice it, you can't really go back. Because the absence stops feeling natural and starts feeling constructed. Which leads to a bigger question. If these stories were softened, reframed, or left undefined, what happens when society finally stops doing that? What happens when something that was kept ambiguous for centuries is suddenly forced into the open? That's where things get uncomfortable. And that's exactly where we're going next. What happened when this stopped being invisible? When relationships that once lived quietly started being named? The reaction wasn't acceptance. It was control. As the world moved into the 20th century, societies became more structured, more documented, and more obsessed with defining what was normal. And once something is defined, anything outside it becomes a problem. Women who loved women were no longer just misunderstood. They were categorized, labeled, studied. It was enough to make people careful. Very careful. And yet, something didn't change. People still chose each other. Even when it became harder. Even when it became dangerous. Because no amount of control has ever fully erased human connection. It only changes how visible it is. Over time, things began to shift again. Voices that were once private started becoming public. Letters became archives. Diaries became historical evidence. Lives that were once dismissed started being re-examined. Historians began asking different questions. Not, were they just friends? But, what are we choosing not to see? And that shift matters. Because it moves the conversation from doubt to awareness. Today, when people look back, something feels off. Too many patterns. Too many similarities. Too many lives that follow the same structure but are described differently. And once you notice that, you start reading history differently. Because it raises a larger question. How many other stories were shaped, not by what happened, but by what was allowed to be said? This isn't just about the past. It changes how the present is understood too. Because the idea that these relationships are new or modern falls apart. What's actually new is the language, the visibility, the willingness to name something that was always there. And maybe that's the real story. Not that this history existed, but that it survived. Through generations of being renamed into something safer. And still, it left traces. Enough to be found. So the next time you come across a close friendship in history, a lifelong companion, a shared home, a bond that seems just a little too intense to fit the label, ask yourself, are you looking at what was written? Or what was meant? Because sometimes, the truth isn't missing. It's just been translated. The strangest part isn't that this happened. It's how easily it disappeared. Entire lives reduced to silence. Stories that existed, but somehow never made it into what we call history. And maybe that's the real pattern here. Not that these women didn't exist, but that someone made sure you wouldn't hear about them. If this is the kind of history you want more of, make sure to subscribe so you're here for the next one. Because some women didn't just love differently, they lived differently. And history really didn't like that.